It's absolutely
Hello everyone and welcome back in to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, and we are continuing to look into our positional rankings. This is our second to last one of the week with our tight ends. Now, the tight ends this season have been in some ways underwhelming, in others a little bit so-so. They haven't necessarily been as good a position as I thought they would be, or as many people in fantasy football circles thought they would be, but they still hold merit in terms of matchups. And this week, I feel like nothing screams matchup more than these four tight ends. I feel like as the season goes along, more and more of your decisions based on tight ends will come down to matchups. So, hopefully these segments are what separate you, deciding between one guy who you feel like is the superstar of your team, or a guy who just feels like in his respective matchup could be a guy that you want to utilize often in terms of his style of play. So without further ado, let's jump right into our fantasy rankings. And this guy played Monday night, actually had, I believe, his best game of the season against LA, and is someone who I really think that in the second half of the season, as he continues to develop his rapport with Kyler Murray, will develop into a guy who's ready to become one of the premier tight ends in football, and that is Trey McBride. He had 10.1 fantasy points versus LA, not necessarily, you say, the top tier of fantasy production from a tight end, but still better than what he had been in terms of output to start the season. And in this matchup against Miami, I feel like he's going to be someone to exploit their lack of linebacker depth. Obviously, they have a couple injury concerns in there with Jalen Phillips potentially missing. I do believe missing yet again another full season for him. We wish him the best because I love seeing that. But that lack of linebacker depth is what stands out to me in this matchup for Trey McBride. He's going to be able to find more soft spots, really help Kyler Murray underneath, and potentially open up the vertical passing game for him to stretch the field to kind of create that tension in the Dolphins secondary, which still is one of the better ones in the league, but haven't necessarily faced an offense much like what the Cardinals can be at their best. And I do think in this game the Cardinals will be at their best. We saw glimpses of what their best looked like against LA. We saw the difference that players like Kyler Murray, Trey McBride, and Marvin Harrison can be. It's just a matter of having it all click any given Sunday. And on this Sunday against the Dolphins, I do believe it will all click, especially with Trey McBride in a vault. And Splash says, who do you have on Thursday? Running line Vikings minus 150 and the Rams plus 130. I did say that I had the Vikings kind of begrudgingly in this game because it's a weird one. I just think that they're the more complete team. Brian Flores' defense feels like the more complete unit, and thus I feel like win or lose, the Vikings will have no sweat off their backs in this one. But getting back into the tight ends here, my second one that I want to kind of cover was just on a bye, and who I'm still really waiting for to break out. But in this weirdly intriguing NFC matchup, feels like someone who's ready to take that next step for an offense that really needs it at this point in their season. Jake Ferguson going up against the 49ers, like I said, coming off the bye. So you never really know with players coming off the bye, especially, tight ends who, like I said, haven't really factored into their team's offense that much. But this certainly feels like a game where the Cowboys need to explore other options outside of forcing certain things, so to speak. I've said my spiel and rant on the Cowboys countless times in this so I'm just going to leave it at needing to incorporate different elements, different nuances to this offense and not, go into specifics, because I don't necessarily think it's the fault of certain players. It's more the fault of the corner the organization has backed certain players into, what with the pressures of how they need to deliver going forward. And so, if guys like Jake Ferguson, guys potentially like Jalen Tolbert, potentially Rico Dowdle in certain capacities can be incorporated, integrated into this offense in a meaningful manner, then the Cowboys could have something. And in this game against the 49ers, the 49ers, not necessarily a team with a full bill of health themselves. You really need to find different ways to open up your attacks. We've seen what it could potentially look like. Some guys have stepped up, but I want to see an all-out effort from everyone concerned in this offense. And it starts with Jake Ferguson, because Jake Ferguson can be a problem, especially, like I said, early in the season, in the red zone. And so I want to see more opportunities and more touches for him in certain moments in this game on Sunday. But going to our third tight end of the week, this guy has kind of been one of those guys who you should feel is still going to have one of the better fantasy tight end seasons this year, but just doesn't necessarily have as much influence on this offense as I initially thought. And that is Dalton Kincaid, going up against a Seattle team that should be coming off a high, going on the road, and utterly dominating that Falcons offense. But in this matchup, I feel like the Bills' passing attack needs to stay true to what it feels like it was trying to do earlier in the season, right? By simplifying things. I love the addition of Amari Cooper now that I've seen him integrated into this offense, but I do feel like the best way to keep everyone satisfied is to really get back to this offensive roots, which is Josh Allen protecting the football with simplified passes. And Dalton Kincaid was a big part of that, and that's the reason why I feel like against a Seattle team who has proven to be soft at the linebacker position, a little bit weak in terms of their depth there, although they did just sign Ernest Jones. Maybe he can be a helping hand in that department. I just feel like Dalton Kincaid is someone who can exploit the short to intermediate areas of the field for Josh Allen to operate with. And so, even though, it certainly feels like the Bills' passing attack might pretend to go back to that verticality that we saw in the Stephon Diggs era and potentially even earlier in Josh Allen's career, I do want to see, a guy like Dalton Kincaid still have a big impact in this game as well. But that's just my interpretation of this. It could be that, on the road, the Bills' offense kind of stagnates because on the road, Josh Allen has not necessarily looked as much of himself as he has at home, so that could be a huge factor as well. But Dalton Kincaid can be the security blanket in this game for the Bills, and so that's what I want to see out of him this week. And it's more of a matchups-oriented vibe that I'm getting from him rather than, a complete comfortability, even though he is still one of the premier tight ends you think about from a fantasy perspective. But then the last guy that I want to talk about, another Dalton, potentially someone who will not necessarily be as favorable in terms of his whole profile than some of the other guys I've just mentioned. But Dalton Schultz in this matchup against the Colts certainly feels like he can be someone who can get going in this Houston offense. Now, the problem that I feel this Houston offense has is that I don't know what to think of their identity in situational moments. I feel like they want to incorporate more of the running game, and the best parts of their offense this season have stemmed from the running attack. But when they pass the football, I don't necessarily feel like, they know what their intentions are in terms of whether it be in early downs or in third and longs. I don't necessarily know what their kind of scheme is playing out for them. And so I feel like they need more players, especially those who are more comfortable in their respective offenses, as Uma Pesawak Walker 12367 says. It's interesting in what I'm talking about. I am talking about these tight ends, my man. But in the profile of this Houston offense, I do feel like Dalton Schultz is someone who can't just be overlooked. I know that they want to incorporate, Stephon Diggs, and when Collins comes back, he's going to be reintegrated. And they still have one of the best wide receiver threes in the league in Tank Dell. But my feeling is that in order for there to be more intentionality to what Houston does in obvious passing situations, there needs to be more of a game plan. And Dalton Schultz, against teams, especially in the division like the Colts, who much more predicated on stopping the run than anything else, is going to be someone who can unlock defenses. He's not the biggest, best tight end out there, but he's someone who, in certain situations, can put up meaningful points for you. And this week, there's no better matchup and no better place to do it than a divisional showdown that could really cement them as the team to beat in the AFC South. But let me know what you think about this in the comments, because these tight ends have been really weird to kind of parse throughout the season. But when we come back on the other side, we officially conclude my positional rankings for the week with my defense and special teams units that you have to look out for this week. So we'll be right back to talk about them after this short break.